appreciate everybody coming back and giving us a second shot at this. I'm not sure what the root cause of what happened last time was, but I think we've got some countermeasures in place to make sure that doesn't happen again. Today, we're not so much going to be talking about the process of problem solving itself, but more so ensuring that everybody every day in your organization is solving problems. And we're going to do that from the perspective of a systems approach. So we'll discuss what the various elements of that system are, how they work together, and how that promotes and ensures accountability for problem solving. So I'll let this is John. I'll let my dad introduce himself. He's the one that started our company.
Yeah, this is John, and I started my working career in manufacturing and worked for a number of years, and got an opportunity to come back to Kentucky from California to work for Toyota to start a new plant that they started in Georgetown, Kentucky. I've had done a lot of writing, written 3 books and a number of articles, and you can find those on LinkedIn. But I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to spend time with you to help you understand. This is we look at things from a systems perspective, and we so we'll talk about that quite a bit. Yeah, so that's me.
Awesome. Well, I'm Ryan Allen. We're both located in Louisville, Kentucky. That is the home of the Kentucky Derby. You guys probably know what that is, as well as the bourbon industry. Kentucky produces 95% of the world's bourbon. And I like Irish whiskey myself, and I think bourbon is a fine companion to that. I've got 4 kids. I've got 3 Newfoundland dogs, 2 cats. I like auto racing. I like cooking. So just a little bit about myself there. I've been with TSD for almost 20 years now. Cut my teeth doing basic process improvement coaching on the shop floor, and eventually ran projects at plants and then groups of plants. And now I run TSD. Also, I'm launching something called CI Works, which is our effort to make lean coaching and support more accessible to smaller middle market manufacturers. So the intent there was to really analyze what the value add is in what we do and find a way to deliver that more efficiently. It's still under construction. It's an ecosystem of online training and coaching, as well as a community of practice. So leveraging the concept of groups of companies getting together and learning from each other, as well as connections to vendors of various lean wares, whether it's storage, software, material handling, conveyance, that kind of stuff. So, today the focus is on one, understanding the system that supports a problem-solving culture, and John will be talking about that, as well as understanding how you embed that at every level in the organization. So what the system looks like, how it happens. And then I'm going to go through a real world example of a customer that we had that I think was a particularly good example of achieving that culture of continuous improvement with problem solving embedded into everybody's roles every day. But in particular, because of the way they started and how it seemed like they had some insurmountable problems. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the systems that support problem solving. Stability is what we consider to be the prerequisite to having a basis of comparison to start down that journey. John's going to talk about the thinking system, and so that's the mindset, the beliefs, and how all that integrates in with the system. So how the system supports that in developing people. He's going to talk about what's required as far as commitment goes. I'll go over the case study, and then we're going to leave you with some practical tips. So over to you.
Yeah, so let me start off by saying that when we launched the plant in Georgetown, Mr. Cho told us that the Toyota production system was common sense and applied industrial engineering. And all of us looked at him and thought, hey, this is way different than that. But we found out that indeed this was true, and this led us to begin to look at the implementation. We had the advantage of everything being brought to us from Japan. We had a mother plant, the Tasumi plant. They gave us our standard work. What you know about a startup is that there's generally a lot of chaos. And because it was so important to us to have a product that sits on the showroom with the same product from Japan, we couldn't afford to have anything less than the best quality. So we made sure that the early emphasis and the emphasis for Indeed for 3 years was around quality and making quality happen. The other thing we know about a launch is usually there's a big push on everybody's part, to get product through and to get product through. And we had to change that thinking because what we wanted people to do is learn and learn from the problems that they had. It's very hard to get stability early on. And so there are a number of things that you really have to do to create a system that supports both in-station quality, and respect and mutual trust from the employees. The stability is the ability to find deviations. And the deviations are from the standards, and the standards we had, as I said, from Japan. What we knew about that was that it was successful in Japan. That what we got was a formula for success. What we had to work very hard on is to help people understand how that success turned into stability and how that stability delivered the best products. If you have the proper stability in an organization, what you find is that there's generally a fair amount of chaos of things as people are learning and going. So we had to work very hard to create a system that supports the stability. And the system was based on the fact that we wanted the operators to tell us when there was a deviation from their standard. We wanted them to feel free to answer that, or to pose those problems to the organization. And we wanted to make sure that they knew how important they were. So we put in a response system called our team leaders. And the team leader basically has the responsibility of making sure that if there's any deviations from the standard, that those deviations are immediately taken care of. The team leaders were set up as one team leader to 5 people, and the expectation is that they would get to the operator within seconds. Once they got there, then the first question they would ask is, what in your standard work were you unable to accomplish? And they would go from there. In most cases, there were temporary countermeasures that were put into place, and those countermeasures had to be resolved, and the team leader had responsibility for making sure of those. But in most cases, if they got a piece of defective material, they would just hand them a new one, and then take that piece of defective material to production control, where they would work with suppliers. So since our stability was based on our ability to find these kind of deviations, we had to make sure that the environment was one of trust. So we also, in addition to having that support, put in place no blame. And this said that if you find a problem, then everybody would praise you and applaud for you, because we all knew this is how we were going to get better. So we worked very hard to set the environment where people would identify problems. We set the environment where people had mutual trust for it. And all of these are some of the early things that supported stability. In addition to that, and sort of the back office kind of thing, we wrote policies that were based on accountability. And the accountabilities were simple. I'm an operator. I'm accountable for my standard work. Everybody else is responsible for making me successful. But the policies were written such that the accountability went to the person. And as the problems existed, then we were able to work the problems without blame, and with an opportunity to demonstrate and show to them. The driving force for what we were doing was the integration of all these separate pieces together into what is called the production system. the production system is really an accumulation of a bunch of things learned over time. In Japan, they learned them the hard way. And that was in 1950, they had the entire workforce walk out and say, this is not Japanese culture. And they had a reconciliation and brought them back and basically said that, hey, you're right. We are from this point on going to change how we deal with their team members and make sure. If we define stability, then stability is sort of the target, not sort of, it's the target to achieve. For us, it took 3 years to establish that target and know that it could be sustained over time. So with the deviation in the midst of chaos, it becomes very difficult. So all of these issues that were presented to the person who was building the product became the primary source of the issues that we had to work and resolve. First came the standard. We knew the standards were right because they came from Japan. But next came all the other issues that came into it, including supplier what they presented to the organization. What we were achieving as we went along is that the operator not only had accountability for the process, but they also had ownership. If you're starting this with a brand new set of standard work, I will assure you that the biggest piece of helping the value adders achieve accountability is to let them design the standard work. Now, here's the issue. The issue is it's not without support from all the other support organizations. So whatever was designed in standard work went through engineering, it went through quality, it went through production control to make sure that what they were doing was consistent with achieving the highest quality product. So even if you have a really great plan and you understand all the bits and pieces that you want to, the first plan, as the military is fond of saying, after the first skirmish, you abandon all your plans and start over. That wasn't the case here. What the case for us was that we had to constantly be aware of what was going on, and thus we wanted to create the environment of mutual trust and respect. But we also wanted to make sure that no problems got from one operation to the next. So the rule was that if you're unable to complete your standard work, or if you had a problem with it, you had to signal. In the Toyota system, there's only one way to get in trouble, and that is to hide a problem. And the key to achieving stability is knowing when you're unstable. So we had to constantly, check and make sure that everything was flowing smoothly. We had to be very cautious in terms of anything that came out of the quality confirmation. And we had to be very careful to make sure that any learning we had went right back to the person in the operation. Many times we asked them to go to the operation where the problem they delivered to a downstream process showed up, and to see what it is so they can come back and understand what they need to do to make sure. So stability is part of a system, and the system is all aimed at customer satisfaction. We had to put in place 5S, and you probably all have done that. The real issue with 5S is that in itself, it is a standard. And so it's not just getting things looking tidy and then forget about it. There was a constant effort. We also had to put in place a pace of production that also included the time that we have for learning, and to make sure that the time we had for learning was really when the line stopped, when we had if the line stopped, when we had a deviation, that indeed we made sure we learned it. The standard for that was that anytime you had a change to your standard work, which was very seldom, or anytime you had something that helped you understand it better, then it was to be put in writing. And what that really means is that we captured the learning in the standard work. So we had an organizational structure, as I said, team leaders who were responsible for helping to solve problems. We had group leaders above that, which are supervisors, and everybody on the manufacturing team was making sure that what they were doing was creating an environment for success. So there was no blame. People were congratulated for finding problems. They were also encouraged to make sure that the understanding of what the problem was clear. At this point, we didn't have them solving problems because we wanted them to focus solely on the process of quality. We had an organization that had a set of managers, and the managers were focused on two things: one, customer satisfaction, and two, development. So everything we put into the organization in terms of the learning process, the learning from mistakes, the training that we had to do had to be based on that person achieving success. And the real accountability issue we had was that when people came late to work or didn't show up for work, because we had a continuous flow manufacturing process, that was a big problem. What was different in that was that once that person was in front of their supervisor, the accountability said that they had to figure out. We were not going to say, well, you had 3 absences, you're allowed 6. We basically told people, you have to be here every day, and if you're not, you have to make arrangements for somebody to take your place, which was usually the team leader. So the team leader didn't have the opportunity to resolve problems and respond to the andon system or the signal system. So it caused a lot of juggling around, usually with a group leader working as a team leader. So the accountability was really important. The policies that supported that basically said, we expect you to be here every day, just in that case, and it's your accountability to, once you have a problem, to figure out a resolution to it. I was in a Ford assembly plant, and I went to the end of the line in quality confirmation, and there were cars everywhere. And so I asked the final assembly manager, what are all the cars about? And he said, oh, that's my kitty. I have to keep them around. I said, really? Why? And he said, I'm not sure, except that my boss will yell at me if I don't meet my numbers. So the truth of it is, when you go back in the process, you find that there were a lot of issues that never got resolved. What we understood is if we were going to achieve a smooth flow, single piece flow, that we had to resolve issues. A kitty was completely unacceptable. And at the end of the line, there was a quality confirmation area, and there were 9 stalls where cars could be fixed if there was a problem. When that 9th car arrived in the stall, we shut the plant down because it was wildly out of control. The real issue is that everybody was focused on performing their standard work, which was the best way forward. That allowed us to have more predictability in our processes, and that allowed us to build a system of stability. That system had in it 5S and visual management, as you might understand. The real issue in an organization that values industrial engineering thinking, one of the most important things that happened was the rearrangement of the work, so it was convenient for the operator to get to their part and get them in the car. As I talked about, we had roles and responsibilities aligned to that, with the team leader responding to any issue you had. We had standard work put in place from Japan, and job instruction, which is a way we teach standard work, was a tool that we used quite effectively. If a person was having problems with their standard work, then we would take them with no blame, take them back to job instruction and help them understand, some knacks or some other things that might help them achieve, their standard work predictably. And then finally, there's problem solving, which, again, the emphasis early on was that people had a duty to let us know that there were problems, but we took on that responsibility for problem solving. As I said, it took us 3 years to make sure and assure that we had the right stability. You've heard a lot about PDCA and PDCA problem solving. What was important about that is that it's a simple model, that everybody can understand it. And we assumed that all the operators, and indeed this turned out to be true, could not only understand it, but understand how to do the most important part of it on the front end, which is to help define what the problem is. So when a team leader came into an operation, they basically said, what's the problem? What in your standard work were you unable to achieve? And this was a clear message that the PDCA cycle was in effect for the check piece of it. The other piece of it is that because it's a simple model and eventually everyone could use it for continuous improvement, we basically verbally told them what was going on, but didn't expect them to solve problems at this point. Again, our focus was quality and we wanted them to focus on their standard work. Our goal was to teach people how to think, not just do. And that led the ground to what we called the thinking system. What you'll notice about this, and it may be a little bit hard to see, but everything focuses in on the place where value is added. Surrounding that is the problem-solving model, and surrounding that were the ways that we used to understand how the problem-solving model was perceived. We learned a lot about methods because we figured out different ways to do things, but we also learned that the cycle was a really important one, and the most important part of that was that we were able to define the problem using facts. So when we asked them about their standard work, that was the first fact, to find out where it couldn't happen. Also understand that the thinking system has guidance in terms of the direction that we're going through the Hoshin process, which is a process of deploying the goals of the organization completely down through the organization. And then making sure that people understood what those goals were through writing a plan, and that plan then became their commitment to accomplish. Unlike most organizations I've been a part of, those plans were very active and looked at very often to make sure that people were on the plan, and it's not the kind of thing where you complete a plan and put it in your desk drawer. So again, we were trying to build this thinking so that people understood that no matter where they were in the organization, they were supporting the things that were most important to the organization, which were the annual goals. And that annual goals then were based in strategy of where we wanted to be with our product. Yeah, participation is something that's actually absolutely important in a continuous improvement organization. What we knew is we had to create the environment where individuals felt supported and allow them to take the initiative and make decisions about the problems that they were looking at. However, it doesn't come with this open commitment to just improve anything. One of the rules of the participation system later on was that you couldn't have a suggestion unless it was about something that you could fix. The other part of this participation is that we had an attitude of, well, let's try it. We built small areas in the back of each shop so somebody could go back and put together something that they thought would be helpful to them. But an idea or a suggestion was never a suggestion until it was proven. And so that way we avoided a couple of things. One, you couldn't have an idea unless it was about your job until we later had team suggestions. And therefore you had to be able to implement it. And therefore we kept people focused on what they were doing, but we supported them in what they were doing and had an attitude of, let's try it. And you can imagine some of the things that came out of that, which were horrible after they tried it, but again, we congratulated them for their thinking and their participation. I think probably the most important, and we found in our practice, the most difficult part of implementing a continuous improvement system is the commitment. And commitment has to run throughout the organization. And obviously, the first commitment is to standard work. And what we taught people in terms of identifying problems was that they needed to be taken care of. And once they identified a problem to a team leader, they saw immediately and later that indeed we took improvement seriously, or we took the sustainment of the standard work seriously early on. The leader's commitment to support is something that's much more difficult, because basically the leaders come into the organization, and like we were at Toyota, with the belief that they were successful because they had been successful in their old job. It was a learning for all of us that were in management that basically we had two things that we did. We had to make sure that we were not doing anything to interfere and or supported the delivery of customer satisfaction. But the second thing, which we took very seriously, was that we were continuing to develop people. We defined 120 hours of training that people had to have in order to be fully competent. And as you might imagine, we spread that over the 3 years so that it could be planned for. The group leaders or supervisors initially, when they heard that, as you might imagine, didn't have a positive reaction to it. But one of the things we had to teach them is to how to plan, because we had set a standard for 40 hours a year for learning. Obviously, the people producing the product were constantly learning. And so it was the rest of the organization that we focused on training development early on, while the line focused on job instruction and their standard work. You can't have commitment without individual accountability. People understood that they were accountable not just for their process, but they were accountable for their interaction with the team and accountable for the goals that had been sent down through the organization through the deployment process. And then the last thing I'd say about commitment is that you have to create an environment for continuous improvement by welcoming problems. So there's been a lot of struggles along the way. The lack of commitment from leadership in most places, again, is very difficult. And I would say that there were two pieces of that we found to be very important. The first one is that they understood that where they were before was not Toyota, and we were different. And our expectation was that leaders were in the line as support. And as support, they had responsibility for creating the excitement and responding to people's issues and so forth. The other thing they had a commitment to is that leaders had two roles. One is to define the future, and the other is to develop the person and to accomplish customer satisfaction. So we limited the leadership and began to impart the lesson about the team all being focused on those people that added value. We put in place a selection system that was based on defining past behavior. We believed that past behavior was the best indicator of success in the future. We screened over 120,000 people to get 1,300 people to as our initial employees. They all came in there with an understanding of what teams are. They came in with an understanding of accomplishment, of accountability, all through the selection system. Also, when you're trying to make decisions about implementing Lean, one of the things you can consider is that you start in a place which is your learning place, and it's a limited engagement. What we found is that if you put in a limited engagement without the vision and the understanding on leadership that here is how we're going to expand, and here's where we're going to expand it, and here's what has to be put in place, then that limited engagement became a test rather than an opportunity for learning. And so most leaders need to have a wider vision of where you're trying to go and what you're trying to get to. At the same time, there was a conscious strategy unknown to us, very closely held by the Japanese coordinator. But there was an overall strategy that we knew if our cars didn't show up on the market on the showroom floor without being as high quality as the one in Japan, that we had a real problem. So our initial strategy was quality only, and then after 3 years, then we were able to expand that to quality and productivity. What's important about the strategy is that it's not just a document, but it turns into a plan for execution. And planning was very important because that was the way that a leader understood what their subordinates were about to do, and that they saw that their execution was consistent with what's being needed, and that they had given thought to their development and what had to happen in terms of their development. So a plan was really a standard as you go forward.
All right. Well, I'm going to introduce the case study. This was a manufacturer that produced blades for the pulp and paper industry, and those are essentially the tooling that applies coatings and or sizes paper based on thickness. So very high precision process, very difficult to do. But I'm going to first reiterate that the only reason that this project was successful was because we had total engagement. So leadership was very engaged. They were demanding, but very fair. We put in a system of accountability that ensured that everyone was A, exhibiting the right behavior, and B, the right thinking, and C, faithfully executing against plans that we had. And I think the most vital part of the whole thing was that everybody worked in this system. Everybody was solving problems all the way down to the operators on the shop floor. And that was the key turning point for this company as well, once they engaged the operators in the problem solving process. So I took some of their original documents and just recreated them so they were, wouldn't give away anything they wouldn't want given away. Background, this was a large multinational company that services the pulp and paper industry. They had a facility in Wisconsin here in the US that purchased a business line from another company and transported the equipment from the West Coast in Oregon all the way to Wisconsin. My first engagement with this was a kind of a call for help. Their scrap rate had gone through the roof. At one point, it was over 150% of their net sales. So you can imagine that there was pressure that they were going to shut down the business line if they weren't able to make it profitable. By the time I got there, that was down to around 38%, which was still not particularly profitable for them. World class, according to an expert in the industry, was about a 20% scrap rate on the product. So as you can imagine, it is a complicated process, high precision. Their efforts that I walked in the door there was a large group of primarily experts. These are technical experts, engineers, some of their leadership, and some of their managers, basically sitting in a giant auditorium with about a 20-foot wide screen, scrolling through data that they had collected. So it was an expert approach, right? So it wasn't a full engagement approach. There were some good things that came out of that. They developed a very good data collection system, so there was no shortage of data, and I think a lot of people can understand that and how helpful it is. But what do you do when you've got all this data and you don't really have a path forward? They were struggling. They were still not solving the problem. What they were coming up with was literally thousands of new problems every month, analyzing every one of them and trying to understand it from a lot of perspectives, but never trying to understand it from the perspective of how the work actually gets done on the shop floor by engaging the operators that do it. So, from that, we use the Pareto principle to define what their most common causes of defects were. About 96% of them came from three major defects. We checked other things, raw material, operator capability, didn't know because they hadn't really engaged them. They did have standards. They were an ISO 9000 facility. But if you understand how that typically works, the process standards were kept in a binder in the quality manager's office and not accessible and not particularly easy to follow for the operators. Machine capability seemed okay. Because of the defects that they had, it was very difficult for them to do setups. So typically they would run out almost 200 feet of steel coil before they had dialed it in and started to hit quality. So that's a little over a quarter of a coil of steel already scrapped right off the gate there. Through this process of understanding what their problems were, obviously quality loss, but they had production efficiency issues as well. The organization had a goal to take over 20% of the market share in that industry within 5 years of where we were at that point. And the understanding was that based on their production efficiency at the time, they didn't have the capability to achieve that capacity. And so there was a very pressing need: one, make the place profitable; one, be able to hit their capacity goals. And this is where the magic started happening. So they defined at a very high level what the problems were. And we began inviting the operators into the conference room, and then shortly thereafter going out onto the shop floor with them to see at the Gemba firsthand what the problems were. It became really clear. There was other issues with the machine and material, but I'll just focus on the man and method for this. They had general processes that they followed, but when you observed operations from operator to operator, you saw that they did not have stability. So that was the first problem. And as John mentioned earlier, there's a lot of systems of stability. They didn't know when they were out of standard until it went to quality for the quality confirmation. They didn't know how to get help when they had a problem. They would try to troubleshoot things on their own, but there really wasn't a good support system set up for them. So it became pretty clear right off the bat that we had to establish some systems of stability. So we went through a phased process. The first thing we wanted to do was set up the systems of stability, right? So there was two pieces to that. One, obviously, we had to standardize the work they did and standardize the workplace and make it very obvious when there was a deviation from the standard. Two, we had to set up the support system between the supervisors and the managers that oversaw that part of the process. They had to know when to signal and how the help was going to occur. Some basic practical problem-solving training, leveraging the PDCA process to make it easy for them to remember how to do it, really helped make problem-solving second nature to them. The last piece to that was we had to get everybody engaged in this. So even still with those systems in place, you didn't have total engagement. So we decided to make it allowed for the operators and supervisors on the floor to find daily frustrations and just get in the habit of starting making small changes, to use PDCA thinking to not only plan them, to implement them, and then ensure that they were effective, and then finally follow up on them and standardize what they did. So the organization got into the habit of running through that PDCA cycle every time they came across a change. And this was done very informally. These are small things, daily frustrations. But allowing them to solve those problems really opened them up to engaging in the continuous improvement process. Eventually, the processes were stabilized, and it became everybody was working the same way. We used job instruction, as John mentioned earlier. We used job instruction training to ensure that not only do they have the standard, but they know how to execute that standard. From that, deviations became more readily apparent, and we could solve problems right then and there. And all of a sudden, didn't seem so insurmountable. Quality started improving. The workforce was engaged. They were very satisfied in this process. And I'm going to talk about this in a follow-up slide here, but we put in place a governance system, and that was what connected the strategy down to the daily operations on the shop floor. I think the most impactful part of that were the work groups, establishing work groups to work on real vexing problems for the organization. And all of those work groups were operator driven. It became a source of pride to get involved in those work groups. So this is just an example of what that governance system looked like. The governance system was not only there to steer the organization towards achieving their annual plans and long-term strategy, but more importantly, I think it was a chain of accountability, right? It was a chain of accountability from all the way from top level strategy down to what they should be focused on the shop floor. So at the very top level, you had the steering committee. They looked at strategy, set the direction, managed the annual plan, but more importantly, they said, how can we help? And this is where accountability comes in. The expectation was that when you had a problem, that problem would be lifted up. So a problem on the shop floor could be lifted up to the supervisor. It could be lifted up to the department manager and lifted up to the production manager. All those positions resided at one of these levels of governance structure. So at the steering committee level, you had your senior managers, your leadership. At the implementation team level, we had various department managers, including all the supporting functions, whether it's IT or engineering, customer service, those kind of groups. And then, so the implementation team were really the ones that were managing the day-to-day execution of those plans that we had and defining the problems that we encountered, not small problems, but more of the consistent problem themes, and then establishing work groups to solve those problems. And as I said earlier, those work groups were consisted of operators, supervisors, and a few others. And then I'll say it again, everybody was empowered to make small daily improvements. Anything troublesome, anything frustrating, solve it. Prove that it works, solve it, and we'll look to standardize that across the organization. So in the end, we'll just say that it was very effective. And the effectiveness of it didn't show up until everybody started engaging in problem solving. Once the language of problem solving was the most common discussion that people were having there, everything started improving. I'm not going to go over all the details of this for time's sake, but you can see they met quality goals. They exceeded world class, well below 20% on scrap, and they met their capacity requirements for the future. I'll have to roll pretty quickly through this.
Yes, so the most important thing is that stability is not just an act, it's a series of acts based on the culture you want to. So one of the key lessons is that we had to establish stability before we ever let people change and improve things. And as I said, that took 3 years. And we thought that was a ridiculous amount of time, but actually it turned out to be pretty effective. Leaders set the tone not only for accountability and not only for accomplishing goals, but for the development of culture. And the culture we wanted was where people trusted that they could raise problems. They trusted that people would be responsible with those problems, and they trusted that they would be treated with mutual trust and respect. So those things are really important early on and throughout. It's important to understand that one of the key measures of participation is the level of participation. And so we monitored that very carefully when we got to continuous improvement. Basically, every supervisor knew who and what employees of theirs actually submitted suggestions. And the group leaders worked hard with the team leaders and the team members to make sure that that they would participate, even to the extent of giving them some ideas they can think about. However, and when you have a system that is so precise as the standard work would indicate, you've got to have daily accountability for that. So the rule was never pass on a problem. If you have a problem, you've got to signal and then sometimes stop the line. There are a few things that you can take as general lessons. One is to stop leaving improvement to practitioners. We learned this lesson with Six Sigma. There are not enough industrial engineers for Six Sigma to be successful. We chose as an alternative to get everybody engaged. And the way you get them engaged is to make sure that the improvements that they are suggesting is something they can implement and that they're small. We wanted them solving problems, not in the conference room, but at the Gemba, as we say, to see the actual place, the actual person, and the actual process. So teaching leaders to go to Gemba to solve problems was an important step. Many of them thought they could sit in their offices and solve problems, and they were very quickly ushered out of their offices. Conduct only ad hoc problem solving, problem solving here and there, rather than a structured effort to achieve initially stability and later productivity and so forth. Don't blame people and vigorously solve problems.
All right. Well, ready for the discussion portion?
That was brilliant, guys. Really appreciate it. Fantastic presentation, by the way. So let's open it up. I see there's nothing in the chat at the moment, and the handiest thing in terms of silent sharing for everybody, because we got 36 total on the call, is just throw your questions into the chat, and we'll take them as they come in. So that might be the handiest way. I suppose a question for when the Toyota guys came into Kentucky, you probably had a lot of people with established leadership roles in the past. How did that culture change happen to a completely different environment and a different way of working? How did you get leaders, in particular the initial leaders, to adopt the new culture?
Yeah, well, the first couple things to understand is that Kentucky was chosen because it was an agrarian kind of culture. People came from farms and coal mines and those kinds of things. What we were looking for was their behavior, not where they came from. Interestingly enough, those people who came from other car manufacturers were immediately rejected because they brought all their bad habits with them. But as we explored the behavior, what we found is that people that naturally want to be part of a team, people that want to achieve excellence in what they're doing. We had set down 21 different competencies that we used to select them to come in. And then once they were selected, then they were brought into an assimilation, which basically say, hey, this is different. And this is different because it impacts you directly. And that the most important people in the plant are those people who make product, not the people who manage it. For leaders, it was a more difficult transition because all of them believed they came there because they were successful in what they did before. So there was a little bit of deconfirmation that had to go on in terms of your natural instincts from where you came from were not necessarily consistent with what we expected. And I can remember when that lesson finally came to me, it was told to me as, hey, quite honestly, we don't care how much you know about this. What we want to know is what are you going to do to take care of the people? And I was in human resources, so I had immediate answers for that. But it was quite a change.
A few questions in the chat. Adam, do you want to throw your question in?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, guys. It was a brilliant presentation. I guess just what you went through there was a probably a very quick snapshot of a very long journey, and it was an incredible piece of work. I'm just wondering, was there anything that you did at the time that if you could do it all over again, you might approach it differently?
Yeah, let me answer that very quickly from my perspective, and that is that that we believe when people showed up and had money to pay for us, that they were committed, and that's a bad assumption. The best assumption would have been in the process of being selected, we pressed against them to find out the willingness they had to change. But Ron, you want
Um, anything specific from the Toyota perspective?
Well-
Any changes in hindsight that could have been a different approach to
No,
building the culture there?
No, I think we understood stability and we tried to achieve it. What we found was that when you try to put stability in an organization that's characterized by chaos, that it takes a lot of patience and perseverance on the part of leadership to work their way through it. And as you probably guessed, you can put out a lot of words about that, but everything is in the behavior. So the real important point to me was that we had an agreement around those things, and that we were able and felt free to push against people for their behavior. The biggest problem we had is when we worked in multiple plants that had a single owner, and they were going around behind you and talking to other people about who didn't particularly want to change, and that was very difficult. So I'd say the agreements you get up front is really important.
Very good. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Harry, do you want to throw in your question?
Sorry. Yeah, sure. Thanks, guys. Brilliant presentation. Loved it. I work in financial services, so I was wondering, would there be any change in the approach and the tool set that you've used for your sort of analysis in a more of financial services context? And when we're talking about application of Kaizens and lean improvements in daily work and all that, how does that transpire? That thinking system applies to a broader organizational transformation that any organization is going through.
There's an old saying, if you think yourself a hammer, everything looks like a nail. If you go into the situation with a set mindset as to what you're going to do and put it in place, you'll fail miserably. I think the most important piece is that the depth of the listening and the agreements and the accountability that you're able to gain from it, because every organization is different, and those differences are there for good reason. And if you go in not to find out what those differences are, but to sort of imprint what you're doing on everybody, then I think there's a likelihood that you're going to have some serious problems and maybe even failure.
Right.
Yeah, and I think it's important to, if you understand the journey and how the Toyota production system developed over time, it was all based on conditions. Every single tool that they had was designed to help them lift up problems. Problem solving was the main method to improve anything, and the best way to solve problems is to first know that you have one. And so in a transactional service type environment, you have to leverage the same thinking, but your tools might look different in how you do it and how you lift up those problems. But the most universal thing in Lean is problem solving. It can apply to honestly anything. And so as long as you can lift up those problems and you can find them, you can solve them no matter what the subject.
Yes. Let me add one other thing to that, and I think it's important. When I worked with the management committee, what I found was that American managers were reticent to make changes because they were thinking, oh my God, I'm going to have to live with that for the rest of my life. What the Japanese managers believed is that we only have to live with it until we've either proven it to be successful or unsuccessful, and then we'll make a decision about permanency. So every time we put in place something, we always had to put in place a date at which we were going to make the final decision. So if you ask people to make a decision about the rest of their lives, they're going to make it based on something they probably don't fully understand. So you've got to really be careful about making sure that what they're agreeing to is to implement to the point where you've decided that a decision needs to be made. And I will say this, it requires patience. And it was amazing to me. Some of the most brilliant people in the Toyota production system how patient they were.
Right. Perfect. No, thank you so much. Thank you so
Thank
much for
you.
this.
You're welcome.
Question from Ava.
Hi guys. Actually, it's not a question, just a big thank you for making the point on standards, that it's not good to have the standards, but to make sure that your team, that the group you work with know how to execute them. Because I see this is a huge problem when we set some standards and we assume that people will understand them the same way we want them to understand. And as we all know, well, assumptions are not good, especially in the process. So how do you make sure that your team understands how to execute them? Because even if you have, like, SOPs, then how do you make sure that they really, really understand what steps to take to accomplish the standard?
I'll tell you from the perspective of the organization and the case study. Coming out of the big expert problem-solving meeting in the auditorium that they had, they assumed that they had thousands of different problems, but upon observation on the shop floor and how standards are being executed, they realized there was just one problem, and that was inconsistency in how the process written the same way for everybody could be done in so many different ways. So there's a couple things that you have to put in place. One of the most important ones we did early on was establish the routine of the supervisors regularly observing the process, and where they saw discrepancies, that became, as John talked about earlier, what in your standard work could you not achieve? And more often than not, that led to a quick session with job instruction training to confirm that they know how to do the process. It does take quite a bit of work to document all those, because the job instructions are more detailed than the standard work document is. But once that was accomplished and you had stability in how everybody was doing the process through regular observation, and when they did have problems, lifting them up and seeing what in the standard work needed to change or be more explicit, or even just a complete process change, you started to get more stability. And in doing so, when problems did occur, it was great. This was one of their favorite things. I can point to right here on my standard work where that problem is occurring, which was much better than the deep analysis of pages and pages of data to find the problem. You want to add anything?
Yeah, let me add a couple of things. I think one of the most important things is focus. And we took people off the line to teach them job instruction. And job instruction not only told them what they were doing, but why they were doing it, so that they got a complete picture of their role. And at the same time you're doing that, you can imprint on them the importance of what they're doing. They protect the customer. They have a very, very important role, the most important role in a facility. And once they do that, then they're going to go back to the line and they're going to try to repeat that. But we put a fail-safe in there called a team leader, which anytime somebody deviated from their standard work, the team leader immediately brought them back to it. So it's more complicated than just job instruction. But I think the most important piece of that is that their confidence was built, allowing them to focus solely with a trainer on what they were going to do and understanding why.
So just, guys, I'm conscious of time. That hour absolutely flew by and it was fantastic. For those on the call, this video will be posted up on the network, along with the details for John and Ryan if you want to contact them directly. I think it's been excellent, guys. We might even have you back again because there's probably lots more to discuss in detail. But thanks a million. Fantastic session.
If anybody wants to hang around, we can answer the rest of the questions, or you can email the question to us, and we're happy to hop on a Teams meeting, Zoom call, whatever it may be. And we're always happy to help anybody anytime, and would love to have the conversations.
Yeah, brilliant. I'm going to close the call because we've a tradition of doing it. Just for those in the network, we do have a farmer presentation next month, and we have